Good afternoon. Welcome to this session, Financing LNG to Power and Gas to Power in a Changing World. It's a real pleasure to be part of today's event. My name is Jim Simpson. Like my colleague, Patricia Tiller, who was on the last panel, I am a partner in the Energy and Infrastructure Group at Hunton Kurth. And like Ambassador Morningstar, I too am fairly bleary-eyed right now after following the election since early this morning. Over the past decade, I have spent quite a lot of time working on LNG to power. We have a great panel lined up comprising Peter Purkl, Director, Team Head, Origination and Structuring, Power and Environment at KfW IPEX Bank. Peter and I have worked together and have sat on various panels together. He and his team have financed multiple LNG to power projects worldwide. Haran, Sivam, Principal Investment Officer at the IFC. The IFC has been extremely active and a very important player in this area. Haran has worked with several of my colleagues on power projects in Africa, and the IFC has worked together with KfW in financing LNG to power projects, for instance, in Latin America. Ian Cogswell, Senior Advisor at Portland Advisors, a financial advisory boutique that I have known very well for years. Portland has been very active in large scale, in supporting the ECA groups on large scale LNG projects in Russia, Africa, and elsewhere. Ian brings a tremendous amount of experience in both the lending and financial advisory side in the natural resources sector, and he has been, he's currently very active in the LNG area in Asia. And Neeraj Agrawal, who's the group CFO of Crescent Petroleum. Crescent is one of the largest privately owned oil and gas companies in the Middle East, headquartered in the UAE. I had the pleasure of moderating a panel at last year's Petroleum Economist Gas to Power Forum, on which Neeraj was one of the panelists and brought his tremendous experience in financing gas to power projects. Each of the panelists will say a few words about his organization experience as our discussion progresses. But right now, let's get into it and let's try to have as interactive a session as possible. So at our panel last year, we also focused on financing. I'd like to start off by asking each of the panelists to share a trend or two that he has seen in the area of financing LNG to power and or financing gas to power during the past 18 months. Why don't we start off with Haran?
Thanks, Jim. Thanks. IFC is a worldwide emerging markets financier, and therefore the trends we see are worldwide. I think the last 18 months can be divided into the first 9 months and the second 9 months for obvious reasons. In the first 9 months, in 2019, primarily IFC financially closed on 2 LNG to power projects, and then we went into a lull. But as we see recently, the Asian markets are trying to pick up. We are seeing a lot of proposals in Vietnam. We are seeing activity in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular. And therefore, I think it's a hopeful trend right now. People are increasingly seeing LNG to power as a solution, especially in countries where they don't have access to indigenous gas. So I think this is a hopeful trend that we're seeing, and in 2021, I think it's going to be a fairly optimistic year as far as LNG to power goes. Over to you, Jim.
Yep, Peter, what have you seen?
Well, I think it's for me, it's two trends coming from 2 different directions. One is a political, say, technological driven trend, and the second one is nature of projects and in current situation. I think the first one, I mean, climate protection is a mega trend, so that leads each and everybody into the industry. Need for balancing power becomes more and more evident and prominent due to increased renewables coming on stream. So plans to develop LNG to power becomes more and more concrete in each and every region, and as Haran was mentioning. And that leads into my second, say, aspect of trends, and that is, yes, we have realized a number of LNG to power projects over the last, say, I would say 4 years. But what turns out to be a story behind there, these are complex complex projects. I think it's a typical area for project financiers as we are, but looking forward, I think we need each and every toolbox of project finance in these kind of projects. And that means we need a number of people, a number of disciplines in those projects. And the two ones that you mentioned, Jim, and where we have worked with the IFC together in the Americas, have demonstrated the complexity of projects. So within the last 6 months or 9 months, I think we have seen even better how complex these projects are, because it's very difficult to engage into detailed discussions and so forth. It's not a panel like we do it today. It's complex negotiations, and therefore for me the question is how long will this situation as we have it right now will continue, and how can we say get more freedom in discussion, because that's a key element for me to get these projects that are around off the ground.
Yeah, I think we'll get onto the complexity a bit later. That was also touched upon in both the previous panels, yep. And it's an important point when talking about LNG to power. Ian?
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think trying to pick a trend is really difficult, because LNG to power is, in many ways, we're at the beginnings of the financing journey for LNG to power projects. Yes, there have been, excuse me, a number that have been financed, but trying to pick, a financing model for LNG to power is quite difficult, because there's such a variety of ways that the different projects have been financed. Going back 2 years ago, if you a little bit longer than your time frame that you suggested, but we had the Jawa 1 project in Indonesia that was financed almost exactly 2 years ago. It was the first LNG to power project financed in the Asia Pacific region. It was financed without a government guarantee. And I think there was at that point a belief that we were going to see a lot more, certainly in that region, more projects coming on stream, more financing, perhaps less support than we would see in the past. I don't actually see that that's continued, that trend, if you like. It hasn't become a trend. And as Peter was just saying, what we're finding is projects are taking still a long time to reach a financial close. And each country is different. And trying to just pick a model, therefore, is difficult. However, what we are seeing, if you like, is a trend in a demand for LNG to power. There's a huge demand in certainly Asia Pacific region, where I've been focusing a lot for the last year or so, but also in Africa, in many other countries. And I think that trend is going to continue, because there's a desire and a need. There will be a way found to finance these projects, but it will not be a one size fits all. It will be very much specific to a project.
And Neeraj, we've been talking about gas to power, particularly in the Middle East, or the greater Middle Eastern region. And one of the things you and I had been talking about was central bank support for these types of projects. What have you seen as a trend?
So I think hand in hand with ESG, we must not lose sight of energy poverty. Energy poverty is a key challenge when you look at it in the Middle East, Africa, and some parts of Asia. And really being aligned with ESG, what that really means is you not only have a goal to provide low-cost energy, but replace coal, but also wherever fuel oil and diesel is being used to replace that. We've been an operator in Kurdistan region now for 12 years, and we've been successful in getting the region from 4 hours of power a day to 12 hours of power a day. And we're now trying to get it up to 20 hours of power a day. And we have been successful in closing our financing over the last 6 to 9 months' time. So that remains a goal. In terms of trends, a positive side has been the central bank support here in the Middle East region. UAE in particular has been a leader with $70 billion of support, offering corporates both short-term and medium-term support in terms of principal and interest, but overall injecting liquidity in the banking system to encourage bankers to provide credits to the corporates. We did not see the banking sector as such respond to new loans in sort of, I would say, second quarter and third quarter. But I think in the fourth quarter now, we are seeing the interest which has been picked up by the regional banks now in providing that. And I think it's coming as a result of the decline in the LIBOR and the EBOR rates, which have now significantly gone down as more liquidity has become available in the system. The other trend has been huge success in the region with capital markets. I think the GCC sovereigns have been able to raise huge amount of capital through capital markets. However, in the oil and gas space in emerging markets, that is not yet open. So that is a challenge for project. Overall, as a corporate, our financing requirements remain the same. And I think as a finance officer, we have to be innovative to deliver the capital to the business on terms that we want to do business with. We've been successful. I think there has been some delay in start of some projects, but overall it is very positive for us to see DFIs and ECAs, even during the period of COVID, working from homes and generally being flexible to support borrowers. I mean, I'll talk later on in the conference about some of the innovations, but I'll stop here.
Yes, I think on the subject of supporting projects, closing projects, it's important to mention the Fujairah IPP, which closed during COVID period, 2.2 gigawatts, 2.4 gigawatts, financed with a mini-perm structure in Abu Dhabi. First time that JBIC has actually done a mini-perm financing as well, which was, I think, a very positive development. One of the things that Neeraj mentioned was, the benefits of gas to power. I would think, let's turn it just specifically to LNG to power. And Peter, from KfW's standpoint, what do you see as the benefits of LNG to power projects? Peter, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
There we are.
Now, starting again. So I think where we have a very strong belief behind LNG to power, and especially behind integrated LNG to power, and I think there's a big difference between those two. But let me say, I think we believe that LNG to power and gas to power will have to play a key role for the transformation of the electricity industry. I think that's a mega trend that we're following, and it's necessary to have that element in the equation towards a sustainable, safe future. That's a very key rule that we have within our institution, and we are very determined to support that transformation. Now, what's on the plus side? I mean, we believe it's the best and least CO2 intense technology available. Especially if no gas infrastructure is available, and that's a key question for LNG to power. We think it's especially an element that can substitute, say, coal and nuclear if you don't have a gas pipeline available. And the good thing, and that's what we have seen on our track record, you can have LNG to power projects in virtually every size. So we have done 200 megawatts, we have done 400 megawatts, and we have done 1400 megawatts. So that's basically the whole range of sizes you would need for any grid that's around. We have done gas turbines and we have engines, so that serves that part of the equation. And the most important thing is it provides flexibility. It basically can serve any operational regime that is needed from baseload to mid-merit, even into peak. So we think it's the ideal match for renewable energy, and that's why we are behind it. On the minus side, I think we touched on flexibility, on complexity already. And where does that complexity come from? I think, and that's my mantra, it comes from you need to define an offtake regime. That's the key of everything. So you need to know against what kind of scheme you want to establish an LNG-to-power project. That's the missing part I think in any LNG-to-power project that is not taking off the ground. And that needs to be clearly defined, and it's an easy, but it's apparently a very difficult question that need to be answered at the end by the off-takers or the host government or whoever decides I want an LNG-to-power project. So I think from our perspective, what we have, the projects we have realized that had exactly that part of the equation solved. You knew what you have to finance against, and then you needed to solve the equation, but the equation was there. And that's the part where I see a big challenge going forward.
Yeah, we've seen, and working together, we've seen how complexity sometimes, on the one hand, can make projects take a while to get to completion. On the other hand, it's resolvable. Complex, it is doable, but it can involve time and certainly creative solutions. Haran, what about from the IFC standpoint, the benefits of LNG-to-power?
Jim, I think Peter has touched on the key points. I think we're all working within a climate change environment, and therefore that's the key focus. And as we push on the renewable front, I think what's becoming very apparent with batteries still, for commercial applications, still 10 years away, at least. I think grid connected batteries. I think gas and LNG is the only avenue for baseload flexible generation to increase reliability and supply in countries. As Neeraj said, there is a energy poverty, and we have to address that. And renewables do go a long ways, but I think gas and LNG is key. Now, why is LNG different from gas? I think a number of countries don't have indigenous gas, or even in the region don't have gas. And with the advent of the midstream infrastructure in LNG, it has now become feasible, as Peter said, to look at small size projects, even 300, 350 megawatts in IFC's case, and to look at larger projects. In the early 2000s, when we looked at LNG-to-power projects, it was like the double project in India, 2,000 megawatts. But now we are looking at smaller projects because the midstream infrastructure has become that more scalable. The last point I would make on this, why LNG, what is different about LNG over gas, is that if you can land LNG in a country, then the radius of influence for that terminal becomes very large, because you can transport LNG by road to displace diesel even 1,000 kilometers away and make a big economic difference. So I think LNG, landing LNG in a country can be very catalytic. We financed the AES terminal in Panama about 3 years ago, and just this year they have started now distributing LNG by trucks into other Central American countries, making a big difference. So I think LNG is key now from various considerations, climate change, but also economic growth, etc. Over to you.
And I think that the point about scalability and size is very important. We have worked on projects which were 200 megawatts. Ian, I think that you're seeing some very big projects in the works in Asia these days, particularly in Vietnam, over 2 gigawatts. Be very interested in your views as well about the benefits of LNG-to-power.
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks very much. I think, both Peter and Haran have already touched upon some of these key benefits. There's no point in just repeating what they've already said.
Yep.
But I think the where I see, a country like Vietnam, for instance, it's a very good example of what LNG and LNG-to-power can potentially do. This is a country which has, a huge shortage or an impending shortage of electricity production. The economic growth, the industrial growth, the demand from industrial users, the demand from consumers for electricity is growing, at an enormous rate. And the ability to provide that electricity from, the sort of traditional, the dirtier power stations, the coal, the fuel oil power stations that are both inefficient and heavily polluting, we're reaching the point where they can no longer achieve that. The development of renewables is there, and there's a huge push to develop renewable power generation across the board, from the sort of hydro projects, wind, solar, but it's not going to catch up. It's not going to be able to be developed at a rate in order to satisfy the demand that's going to be there, which certainly in the space of a year to 2 years could mean there are power shortages. And of course, the country itself is geographically very unusual in that you have a huge population in the north, population in the south, not so much in the middle. The gas distribution network in the country is not fully integrated. So therefore, even, indigenous supply, such that it is, cannot be moved everywhere. Now, when you've got that, and that's an example in Vietnam, this is not the only country that has similar types of problems. Now, the benefit of LNG is that it is so flexible. So there's an ability, as we've said, and you've all touched upon, to provide LNG import infrastructure that is smaller and more modular and can be built out. Whereas if you go back 20 years, most of the LNG import infrastructure was for huge onshore regasification terminals, places like, say, Japan, that had this enormous demand, a huge expense for developing those projects, and they were having to sign up as well for long-term expensive LNG long-term LNG SPAs with higher LNG price. That market is changing. The development of the LNG market now, it's not quite a commodity, but it is on the way to being one. LNG buyers have much variety of sources of LNG. They can bring it in at a much cheaper price, and therefore they can service some of the big power stations, the sort of those power stations that you're going to need for baseload flexibility, which is great, but also maybe in some of the more regional centres where there's a requirement for power, for electricity, but it wouldn't necessarily be the economic sense to build an enormous LNG import infrastructure and power generation facilities. So it is that flexibility, and ultimately, like, what is the biggest benefit? I think it is that flexibility, and we are, seeing a number of these countries recognize that flexibility and are now trying to develop LNG to power infrastructure. It's not going to be straightforward, but we can talk about in a moment maybe the risks and the difficulties, but that's the benefit. And I think that if the finance community can find a way to finance these projects quicker, and the development can happen a little bit quicker, then the opportunity over the next 4 to 5 years is huge.
So let's just stick, before we get to the risks, let's stick with the opportunities. Within the EMEA region, Haran, what do you see, where do you see the best opportunities for LNG to power?
So right now, I think, Jim, the market is the one that I see as a good opportunity is South Africa, where I think they have gone in a large way, not necessarily for LNG, it's a technology and fuel agnostic bid, but they've gone out for a 2,000 megawatt bid. That's the deadline has been extended to 22nd of December now from November 15th. But what you're seeing is a large number of private sector players bidding into world-class ports that South Africa has. And this is soon to be followed up, let's say in the next couple of years, with another 3,000 megawatts. So I think I see this as the large opportunity that's showing up. Other countries like Morocco are starting to look at also LNG facilities in Northern Africa, and that could be an opportunity. I myself don't work in the Middle East, so I don't know if that maybe someone like Neeraj would know better about that.
Peter, what do you think within the EMEA region? What do you think the best opportunities are?
Yeah, I think I would concur with what Haran was saying. I mean, Africa is a continent which I think offers a lot of potential, but the question is, how do you convert potential into opportunities? And I think South Africa is one country where we have seen, well, gas or LNG-to-power to run around for a number of years, and apparently coming back to my mantra, the government or the off-taker needs to decide what he wants. And I think that's the part that was difficult in South Africa to define. Apparently now they're forced to decide because they are lacking of power. So they apparently shut out this RMIPP thing because they're in desperate need. So, and that's the key question for me. So that's where I think potential is moved into opportunities. I think there's a number of countries in Africa, and apparently those who have access to importing LNG, if they don't have pipelines, where you could establish such projects. But again, they need to define what they want, and I think that's even, well, at least the same importance. They need to understand that the mechanics of the power industry, which by itself is quite complex, plus add to the equation the LNG dynamics. Now, this is something you could potentially see in North Africa. We've heard of Morocco, but again, there, what's the scheme? So potential is there. All of Africa has that, and it turns down to how to convert it into opportunities. And yes, I agree. It's South Africa, potentially North Africa, and in between, maybe smaller size applications in the, say, 200 to 400 megawatts range, with a lot of development to be done.
And Neeraj, what does, on the gas to power front, what does Crescent consider to be the best opportunity or opportunities in this near term?
Sure. So I think in a simplistic sense, the greatest value for the molecule comes from, and also in the local economy, comes from getting the industry to use gas. So, you know, we're now looking at expansion beyond supplying just to the government. I mean, we supply 75% of our gas free to the local government. And, you know, if you just look at our investment, it has been $2 billion to date. And just the supply of free gas in 10 years is $5 billion. Now, if they had used diesel, the government would have spent $20 billion. So that's a kind of a sense of magnitude of contribution to the financial infrastructure. Now we extend this concept to industry. We're seeing industry in our region where they are using either diesel or others to generate power. I think if they move to gas, it'll move to gas, and also further downstream, it'll not only create employment opportunities, but give them a far cheaper way of generating energy. So we think gas to power would remain a core part of our opportunity in a country like Iraq. I mean, Iraq currently needs something like 2,000 scuff of gas a day today. And I think if you just compare it with renewables for a minute, the Middle East has done so well within the GCC in cutting down the cost of generating power, but that's financial engineering. You know, you have a long-term supply agreement backed up by an investment grade off-taker that gives you the cost of generating power, which is very cost effective. That model is not necessarily replicable to, let's just say, less than investment grade governments, which are standing behind it. And there, you need to look at alternative solutions, if there isn't a political will to accept higher prices. So you do need to look then at natural gas-based opportunities, as a way to generate power. So we see huge opportunity, certainly in places like Iraq and also some of the neighboring countries, as a way to grow.
And so we've talked about opportunities. Let's talk about challenges. Ian mentioned risks before. There was an article, we've talked about Africa. There was an article, a very good article in the Petroleum Economist last year entitled LNG-to-power, a hard nut to crack in Africa. I think it'd be worthwhile to hear from, first from Peter, then Haran, as to the major bankability issues, critical risk issues that you see. And we've touched upon complexity, we've touched upon a couple of things, but some items that we haven't talked about so far that you see as critical challenges to implementing these projects.
Well, I think one of the key issues I think is, and coming back to my mantra again, is the concept of the project. And I think if you look into what we have defined internally as a big, say, exercise in defining where the benefit of LNG-to-power comes from, or gas comes from, is sustainable finance. And if we look into the future of gas, it basically tells you that you would move from base load into mid-merit into peak. That's the path of gas generation as a mega trend. Now, gas projects can do that. They can offer flexibility, but that means you need to design your project according to that. So one key challenge for me is a gas turbine can offer that flexibility. An off-taker might and will need that flexibility, and then you need a fuel supplier or an LNG provider to accept that you would want to have flexible LNG supply contracts. So I think if LNG suppliers believe they will sell a 20-year LNG supply contract, take or pay for a 2,000 megawatt project in wherever it is, I think that will be a difficult sell. So this is where I think a lot of, say, complexity, a lot of due diligence needs to be done to sort out that pass-through equation. And it's a burden on the off-taker, on the project company, and the LNG supplier. That's one big question to be solved.
Yes, I would say, yeah, managing and allocation of flexibility in the entire project architecture is a huge, very important item.
Exactly, and that's the structure of a project. Second area is more a technical thing. How do you deal with all the interfaces coming from that equation? So it's how to basically to integrate the technical interfaces. That's an LNG ship coming into the offloading facility, FSRU or land-based. How do you do all these interfaces from a contractual and technical perspective? And it's, you can summarize that. And is there an EPC rep or not? And Jim, we have gone through that exercise.
And we have spoken about it a lot.
It's one of the points where you can spend months and years on, and there's a certain understanding, at least from the finances side, that an old and easy, say, EPC wrap is maybe not possible. But if you go down the route and accepting, say, sub EPCs or however you want to call it, it adds to the complexity. So these are for me the two, say, main levels of complexity in such an LNG-to-power project. Not prohibitive, can be solved, but difficult.
Haran?
Yeah, so I think Peter has hit it on the head. I mean, I think that's correct. What I would say is, though, we should try and segment these into manageable bite-sized chunks. At IFC, we have financed more than 400 thermal power projects in the last 25 years. So we know we can finance thermal power projects. We have done LNG terminals, standalone terminals, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, And these have been very successful terminals. The one in Pakistan was built in 11 months with Accelerate and a local company, LNG. So what we've been advocating is trying to segment this into, for example, going ahead with an open access terminal to try and not underpin a terminal on the basis of a power project, but on the basis of the economy's need to have access to LNG. So there could be industrial buyers of LNG, etc. So what do you do if you go take that approach? Let's say in South Africa, if you were to have a open access LNG terminal operating today, then their consideration simply becomes, can I add on a power plant to that terminal to offtake gas through that terminal, and not necessarily go through this bundled approach that Peter just laid out, which is seen as complex and difficult for all the correct reasons. So I think we are a strong proponent of telling countries we should unbundle. Up to now, LNG-to-power projects have been financed largely by DFIs and Export Credit Agency-backed financing. I think the litmus test is going to be when commercial banks can step in and take that risk. And for the time being, if you go the bundled approach, I think it limits the amount of sponsors who could take on this entire risk. I think the governments also need to be cognizant that they need to step up and mitigate some of these risks. For example, COVID-related risks, the projects that Peter for KfW and IFC have been dealing with, the government is not taking on any additional risks because of the way the concession is structured. But let's say in South Africa, one would assume the government would stand behind some of the risks here so that it becomes more manageable. So those are the points I would point out as far as de-risking the LNG-to-power value chain.
Ian, what are your thoughts?
I think from our side as an advisor, you know, whenever looking at any project financing, you have a whole suite of risks, sort of both qualitative and quantitative risks that you are looking to identify and then mitigate in some way, whether it is to pass that risk to whoever's best able to actually manage it, or to in some way eliminate that risk. That's what we do in project finance, if you like. In the projects that we've looked at, I think we've kind of identified four risks for LNG-to-power projects, which are very specific, or so not specific to the industry, but particularly important in being able to raise financing. And they are, first of all, just dealing with the fact that you have project on project risk. You have an LNG import terminal, and you have a power generation facility. And it's very unusual in project finance to be financing, you know, two completely separate elements like that. Now, as we've touched upon, and as Haran just touched upon, you know, in some countries it's been easier to deal with that by unbundling and having the LNG import infrastructure financed separately to the power generation, but you still have the project on project risk because you're still selling LNG, so you're still selling gas. So, you know, there are ways that you can mitigate that risk, such as maybe employing an aggregator or through a state-owned entity buying the gas from the LNG producer. But it's a risk, and I think the first risk that you need to deal with is mitigating that project on project risk. Secondly, it's a fact that many of these projects are being developed in, particularly if we're looking in the EMEA region in Africa, countries that have lower country risk ratings than you know, maybe where we've seen some of the LNG liquefaction plants, for instance. So dealing with country risk, how you do that, the involvement of the DFIs, the ECAs will certainly help, but ensuring that there's sufficient mitigation there. Building on from that is the third, which I'd say the regulatory risk. And in many of these countries that are developing LNG to power, the regulation isn't yet fully developed. And so being able to ensure, you know, and for a financier, for particularly the commercial banks, we're trying to get the commercial banks involved, the risk that the regulation either isn't fully developed or could change, that's a very difficult one to manage. So trying to understand how we can develop the regulatory framework to support the financing is very, very important. And then finally, it is market risk essentially, and that is how you mitigate the fact that you're buying LNG. The contract under which you're buying the LNG needs a certain amount of flexibility, And that flexibility is required, but it also will often come with a cost, and that cost needs to be passed through effectively to the ultimate revenue stream, which is the sale of electricity. So dealing with how, you know, that whole mitigating that market risk through the value chain is really important. And I think if you're looking at an LNG-to-power project, any developer focusing on those 4 risks, first of all, if they can find a suitable mitigation for those, then you're really on the way to being able to develop a bankable project.
Yeah, that's very helpful to encapsulate it that way. Before we get to final thoughts and really keys to success, I would like to just touch on one thing that Neeraj had mentioned before, which is capital markets and alternative financing structures. We've talked a lot about project financing, but Neeraj, maybe a few comments on alternatives as you see it.
Sure. I think capital markets would remain a very viable option for well-run companies, even though they are from emerging markets, very cognizant of the country where the business is. But I think the pain of getting a rating done and bringing a degree of transparency through a 144A, yes, I think you can get a transaction done. It's a bit expensive the first time, but I think it provides you a permanent currency that you can encash forever to keep doing projects. To my mind, that is a much better option, than being held hostage to a contractor or an ECA, because you do get the money up front and you do have the flexibility of liquidity to be able to do so. However, in the end, it is very much a function of your circumstances. We as a corporate use a combination of USPP, ECA, DFIs, and capital markets and try and bring in our knowledge to suit in what is appropriate. The second thing I would say is the private debt market. The private debt market is also a very, very viable option. It is a world of low yields. It is a world of low returns. And I think sometimes projects may find money much more regionally than internationally if they are backed up by the right advisors and the right names to find the capital. Finally, as one thought, I would say, I think the World Bank Group has done a tremendous job in providing development capital across the world. But I think their capacity needs to be supplemented with creating more regional institutions in the form of regional megas, which do not have to provide money, but can provide capacity and credibility to enable these projects to get funded. And I think that is a key method as we look at the world, which would see huge amount of capital in the years to come. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. I think we've now come to the end of our time, so I'd just like to go through the panel, just final thoughts, particularly keys to success. Why don't we start off with you, Haran? Since given the IFCs having, as well as KfW, having successfully financed a number of these LNG-to-power projects.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on what Neeraj said and also a cautionary word going forward. I think the DFI community is always subject to pressure on green energy and all of that sort of stuff, and the continued support of LNG as a fossil fuel should be looked at carefully. Therefore, I would say, where I want to pick up on Neeraj's points, is that we should increasingly look to promote local capital markets to participate in these projects. That's more sustainable. So I think that's critical, whether you look at it from a currency perspective or from understanding the risk better, understanding the country's needs better. So I think that's how we should trend as we go forward, so that projects get financed more in a regional or country context than being reliant on the DFI community, etc. That's my last thought, Jim.
Okay, that's great. Ian, final thoughts?
I mean, I think unlocking the keys is, I think all of these projects need to be developed very closely between the developer and the government. government support for these projects is essential. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean sort of guarantees. It will require some guarantees, you know, in countries where they might need sort of guarantee of currency convertibility or something like that. But what it does require is a very strong alignment between the needs of the government, the needs of the country, and how that is then implemented by the different developers. And if you can do that with the right parties involved, then you can, you know, these projects become financeable, and that's ultimately key, because without the finance, the projects don't go ahead. And ensuring that the developers engage with the finance community the earliest possible opportunity, the governments engage with the finance community, very, very key. Otherwise, these projects just stall and they don't happen.
Absolutely. Neeraj, final thoughts?
So 2 comments. Competition. Don't rely on one source of money. You must always have multiple, but if not multiple, at least 2 sources of capital, and make sure all the difficult decisions are made upfront and you carry your board with you before you go to the markets and ask for money. That's sort of one message. The second message I would say is, I think we have to realize that the financial capacity of development banks, DFIs, is not going to be there, you know, for particularly fossil fuel related projects. They all are a hostage of their own shareholders and members. And I think you have some very well-meaning executives, but ultimately the decision making is going to be challenged. So we need to look at alternative sources of capital as a primary means of funding.
And that just provides an excellent segue over to Peter for your final thoughts.
Well, my final thought is LNG-to-power would be, or is definitely a long-term investment. And if it's a long-term investment, the one who triggers the investment is at the end the buyer of the kilowatts or the kilowatt hours. So you need to know what you put up now, and that needs to live for, say, 15 or 20 years. So you need a clear vision and a clear commitment to that. And once you have that, you can go 2 routes. It's an integrated or non-integrated. It doesn't make any difference at the end, because you have to decide at what part you put your risk. If you go integrated, I think the best thing is on the equity side, you have the LNG supplier and the power, say, industry at the same project company. So you have the battle within the project company. It's a difficult battle, but all the equation is then solved at that part, and that's for us the recipe to success. Bitter recipe, but it works.
Yep, no, we've seen that, and you've also seen both. You've seen different structures as well, but we've certainly seen the success of the integrated model. Well, I think our time has come to an end. I'd like to thank all the panelists for an extremely interesting session. And thank you for your time, contributions, and insights. And I'm sure that you know, the panelists would welcome any further questions or exchanges with members of the audience. So thank you.